I still remember the day the High Conclave made the announcement. It was early morning by the Vethara standard calendar, the kind of morning where the twin suns of our home system hang low and red over the crystalline plains, when the air smells like cold minerals and the light catches the spires of the command tower just right, turning everything gold. I was standing in the observation gallery above the grand chamber, looking down at 700 of the most powerful beings in the known galaxy. Senators, fleet admirals, biological synthesis directors. Minds that had guided our civilization for 3,000 years. Beings who had never, in the entire recorded history of the Kethvaral Dominion, been afraid of anything. They were afraid that morning. I could see it in the way they held themselves. The Kethvaral are tall, angular creatures, four-limbed, two primary and two secondary, with long necks and flat skulls that catch light strangely, almost like mirrors. We don't show fear the way humans do. We don't pale, we don't sweat. But our secondary limbs fold inward when we are truly frightened, pressing against our torsos as if trying to make ourselves smaller. And in that chamber, on that morning, every single being had their secondary limbs folded. Every single one. The conclave master, Yeth Soren, stood at the center podium. She was ancient even by our standards. Her plating had gone almost entirely silver, and her optical membranes moved slowly, the way old ones do when they're choosing every word carefully. She had ruled for 40 cycles. She had navigated the collapse of the Outer Rings. She had brokered the peace with the Mern Collective after the Border War. She was, in the most literal sense, the steadiest mind in the galaxy. Her secondary limbs were folded all the way to her chest. She spoke for a long time. I won't relay everything she said. Much of it was political framing, the kind of careful language the conclave uses when it wants to make a catastrophic decision sound like a calm and rational one. But the core of it was simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. The planet called Earth, designated third from star in the Sol system, had been formally assessed as a threat to Dominion expansion. Its inhabitants, a species called humans, type 3 biological, carbon-based, remarkably short-lived, had demonstrated behavioral patterns inconsistent with projected Tier 2 species development. They were not advancing the way a newly contacted civilization should. They were not frightened. They were not negotiating. They were not retreating. They were building. 3 of our scout teams had made first contact in the prior cycle. The standard protocol, arrival in force, atmospheric projection of Dominion symbology. A broadcast in 47 languages, including 3 the humans had never encountered. A clear demonstration of our weapons' capability by vaporizing one of their uninhabited moons. The humans had looked up at the gap where their moon used to be. And then they had gone back inside and started working. Within 6 of their planetary rotations, they had launched 17 new orbital platforms. Within 12 rotations, they had begun testing a propulsion system our analysts had not projected them to develop for another 40 years. Within 30 rotations, one of their vessels, crude, rattling, held together with what our engineers later described as an almost offensive combination of improvised alloys and what they could only call determination, had physically intercepted one of our scout ships. The scout crew had been understandably confused. The humans had not fired on them. They had not transmitted demands. They had simply matched velocity, pulled alongside, and an individual in a pressurized suit had climbed out of the vessel, crossed the gap between ships, and knocked on the hull. Knocked on the hull. Our scout team had opened the hatch because none of them had a protocol for what was happening. The human had climbed inside, removed their helmet, looked around at the interior of a Kethvaral military vessel with wide eyes and what our behavioral analysts later described as barely contained excitement, and then said in their primary language something that translated roughly as, "Right, who's in charge here?" That incident alone had generated 300 pages of internal reports. But it was what came after that brought the conclave to this morning. Because after that first contact, after the vaporized moon and the intercepted scout ship, after the knocked-on hull, the humans had not stopped. They had not gone quiet. They had not retreated or panicked or sent diplomats with offerings of resources and submission, the way every other species had done when we arrived. They had started preparing. Not for surrender, not for negotiation. For war. And the reason every secondary limb in that chamber was folded, the reason Yeth Soren's voice had that careful, measured quality that I had only heard once before in my life, during the worst year of the border war was that our analysts, our most experienced military strategists, our most sophisticated predictive algorithms, had run the numbers 17 times. And every single time, they had come back with the same answer. If the humans were allowed to continue developing at their current rate, for even 2 more cycles, we would not be able to stop them. So the conclave had made a decision. We would not wait 2 cycles. We would send our best. We would end this now. I was 23 cycles old that morning. I was a junior analyst in the intelligence division, barely cleared for the observation gallery, present only because my direct superior, Commander Velkarath, had included me in his morning briefing attendance. I had spent my entire career, all 4 years of it, in comfortable certainty. The Dominion was eternal. The Dominion was unchallengeable. The Dominion had never lost a military engagement in 800 years. Standing in that gallery, watching the conclave master's silver-plated hands grip the podium, I felt something I had never felt before in my professional life. I felt uncertain. I didn't know what to do with that feeling. I tucked it away, filed it, told myself it was just the gravity of the moment, the theater of great decisions, told myself the analysts were being overcautious, told myself this would be over quickly. I was 23 cycles old, and I knew nothing about humans. The unit they chose was the 7th. If you're not Keth Varel, that name might not mean anything to you. But within the Dominion, within every military briefing and every strategy document and every tactical simulation run in the past 4 centuries, the 7th Legion is a name that ends conversations. It's not a boast, it's just a fact the way gravity is a fact, the way light speed is a fact. The 7th exists and it wins. Those are 2 things that have always been true simultaneously. They were founded after the collapse of the Outer Rings, 300 years before that morning in the Grand Chamber. Founded by the war hero Kethmeron, who took 6,000 survivors of a broken fleet, and over the course of 8 years turned them into something that no one had seen before and no one has seen since, a military unit operating on total cohesion. Not just discipline, not just training, something deeper. Something that looked from the outside almost like a single organism with 6,000 bodies. The 7th didn't follow orders the way other units did. They didn't need orders, not in the traditional sense. They trained together for years before any deployment, not months, years, until they understood each other's movements and decisions so completely that communication during battle was almost unnecessary. Observers who watched them in action described it as unsettling, as if they shared one mind distributed across thousands of soldiers. They had a 100% mission success rate. Not 98, not 99, 100. In 4 centuries. When the conclave selected the 7th for the Earth assignment, there was no debate. There was no second option presented. The decision took, by my later count of the meeting records, approximately 4 minutes. The conclave voted unanimously and then moved on to the logistics. I watched the deployment from a secondary monitoring station 3 weeks later. The 7th embarked in full, 6,200 soldiers, supported by the 3 largest warships in the Dominion fleet, the Kethmeron flagship, the Sorin's Fist, and the Voidwalker, plus a full complement of assault craft, automated weapons platforms, and what our strategic division called terminal deterrence systems, which was, in translation, an array of weapons capable of rendering a planet's surface uninhabitable if the mission required it. They were not sending the terminal deterrence to use it. Everyone understood that. Humans were carbon-based biologicals with interesting characteristics, and they would, when faced with the full reality of the 7th, do what every other species had done. They would assess the situation rationally. They would determine that continued resistance was not survivable, and they would negotiate. That was the projection. Commander Velkarath read me the mission briefing on the morning of departure. He had a flat, dry delivery that I had always found reassuring, the voice of someone who had processed too many crises to find any single one dramatic. Duration of engagement, he read, projected at between 12 and 30 planetary rotations. The 7th will establish atmospheric superiority in the first rotation, ground presence by the 3rd, and formal negotiation parameters by the 8th. Human leadership will likely require between 4 and 15 rotations to process the political implications of capitulation. We anticipate full Dominion administrative authority over the Sol system within 45 rotations. He set the document down. Any questions, Analyst Sorrel? I had one. I didn't ask it. I thought about that human in the pressure suit, climbing across open space to knock on a hull, and I thought about the word determination, which our behavioral analysts had used in their report, and something in my chest did a complicated thing that I still can't fully name. No, sir, I said. Good. Monitor the relay feeds and file your observation reports on the standard cycle. He left. I sat down at my station and pulled up the relay feeds and waited for the 7th to make history. They did. Just not the history anyone expected. Chapter 3, The First Transmissions. The journey to Sol system took 9 days by Dominion Fast Transit. The relay feeds were active the entire time, not live, given the communication lag, but close enough. The 7th's command staff transmitted regular updates, and those updates were the most composed, professionally written documents I have ever read. Clinical, precise, the language of people who have done this many times before and expect to do it many times again. General Keth Savar commanded the 7th. She was the youngest general in Dominion history to hold that position, 60 cycles old, which in human terms would be somewhere in middle age, but for Keth Varel is genuinely young for senior command. She had earned her rank through the Mern border campaigns, where she had done something that still got discussed in tactical academies. She had taken a unit of 1,200 soldiers into a Mern defensive position that was rated essentially impenetrable, and she had walked 1,197 of them back out again. 3 losses, in a campaign that the models had projected at 60% casualties. She was methodical in a way that bordered on artistic. She could look at a battlefield situation and see 17 moves ahead while simultaneously managing the emotional state of her troops and maintaining communication with political command. She didn't panic. She didn't rush. She didn't make assumptions. Her first transmission from Sol system approach was typical Savar. Entering outer system, long-range scans complete, human activity consistent with per-contact projections. Significant orbital platform development noted, more than anticipated, but within parameters. No evidence of weapons capability sufficient to threaten fleet assets. Proceeding to inner system at standard approach. Will transmit again upon achieving Mars orbit position. Com measured. We received it with a 9-hour delay. By the time we read it, she was already in Mars orbit. The second transmission was less typical. Human response to our presence is not as projected. Standard psychological protocols applied atmospheric projection, weapons demonstration, broadcast in standard contact languages. Human leadership has acknowledged receipt of broadcasts. Their response is being analyzed, attaching full transcript. Note for intelligence division, human communication style is substantially more complex than prior assessments indicated. Recommend additional linguistic resources. Proceeding on schedule. I read that twice. Complex was not a word General Savar used lightly. She was one of the most precise communicators in the military. When she said complex, she meant something specific, and she meant it was giving her pause. I pulled the attached transcript. The human response to our first contact broadcast, a carefully constructed message establishing Dominion authority, species hierarchy, and the terms of expected submission, had been sent by someone identified as the Secretary General of an organization called the United Nations. The transcript ran to 40 pages. It was, I spent 2 hours reading it, extraordinary. Not in a threatening way, not at first. It was extraordinary in its texture. The human had responded to our dominance display not with fear and not with bravado, but with something that felt almost like curiosity. They asked questions, dozens of them. They asked about our biology, our government structure, our travel method, our history. They asked whether we had poetry. They asked what we ate. And then, buried between questions about our metabolic processes and a request for cultural exchange protocols, was this. We note the demonstration of weapons capability involving the destruction of Luna's outer satellite Phobos-adjacent body designated 2088 BB. We want to be clear that we understand the intent of this demonstration, and we are not dismissing it. However, we want to also be clear that the destruction of this body was interpreted by our scientific community as an opportunity for observational study of the debris field, and 17 research papers have already been submitted to our academic journals regarding the event. We would appreciate advance notice of any future demonstrations, so that we can position appropriate observational equipment. I read that paragraph 4 times. Then I flagged it for Commander Velkareth. He read it once. He was quiet for a long moment. "File it under Behavioral Anomaly Class 1, he said finally. "Yes, sir. Should I escalate to the Conclave?" Another pause. "Not yet. Let's see how the ground engagement develops." I filed it. I kept a copy for myself. I read it again that night, alone at my station, and I thought about 17 research papers. I thought about a species that looks at the destruction of a moon and thinks observational opportunity. I thought about what that quality is called, not stubbornness, not recklessness. I didn't have a word for it then. I found one later. The humans have a word for it, several actually. The one I like best is resilience. Chapter 4, GRUNDFALL. The 7th made planetfall on the 15th day of the campaign. General Savar chose a location in the northern continental landmass of the largest ocean continent, a flat region that human maps call the Canadian Shield. Geologically stable, low population density, close enough to major human population centers to be tactically meaningful without risking unnecessary collateral engagement. It was a considered choice, the kind of choice that demonstrated exactly why Savar commanded the 7th. The descent was flawless. 6,000 soldiers in assault configuration, supported by aerial platforms and a ground-to-orbit weapons net that could respond to any threat within 4 seconds. The Sauron's fist held position at 30,000 feet as a visible deterrent. The Voidwalker maintained orbital watch. The Kethmeron served as fleet command. The landing zone was secured in 11 minutes. It was what happened in the 12th minute that the briefings later struggled to describe accurately. Because 12 minutes after the 7th's boots touched Canadian soil, they were being watched. Not by military units, not by government officials, not by any formal human response system. The signs. I need to pause on the signs for a moment because I have read thousands of first contact field reports in my career, and not one of them has mentioned signs. One of the signs read in the primary human language, "Welcome to Earth, please be respectful of local wildlife." The other sign read, "First contact FANCLUB, meeting since 2031. General Savar's field report on this development was, by her standards, almost emotional. Civilian presence at landing zone requires clarification of engagement parameters. Civilians appear to be observational rather than tactical in nature. No weapons visible. Significant recording activity. Uncertain how to proceed. Velkareth read me that report with the same flat voice he used for everything, but I noticed his secondary limbs had loosened slightly from his torso. "What does she recommend?" I asked. "She's asking for guidance." Savar never asked for guidance. In 30 years of command, she had not once transmitted back to base requesting clarification on engagement parameters. She processed the situation, made a decision, and executed. "What guidance is the Conclave providing?" I asked. "The Conclave," Velkareth said slowly, "is currently in an emergency session discussing whether the civilian presence constitutes a civilian shield tactic." "Is it a civilian shield tactic?" He looked at me for a moment. "One of the signs is asking us to respect local wildlife," Analyst Sorrel. We sat with that for a moment. "I'll note it as a cultural anomaly," I said finally. "Yes," he agreed, "do that." The 7th maintained their position. They erected a secure perimeter. The human civilians, over the following 6 hours, grew to approximately 3,000 people from across that region of the continent who had driven through the night to see alien soldiers standing in a field. Some of them had brought telescopes. Some of them were clearly children, held up by adults to see over the crowd. One individual, field reports noted, had set up a food vendor cart and was selling something called funnel cakes. The 7th had landed expecting to face the most difficult military terrain of their careers. What they had found was a crowd, and they did not have a protocol for that. Her name was Brigadier General Elena Vasquez-Acoro, and she arrived at the 7th's perimeter on the morning of the 3rd day. She came alone. That detail, when it reached me through the relay feed, made me stop whatever I was doing and read the field report 3 times to make sure the translation matrix wasn't malfunctioning. She came alone, not with an honor guard, not with a security detail, not with advisors. She arrived in a single-wheeled vehicle, parked at approximately 50 meters from the 7th's outer perimeter, stepped out, and walked toward the barrier alone. She was wearing her uniform, a dark formal military uniform with ribbons along the chest, and she was carrying nothing in her hands. The 7th's perimeter guards had her in targeting solution within approximately 4 seconds of her stepping out of the vehicle. 4 seconds is how long it takes the 7th to go from 0 to terminal response capability. It's one of the things that makes them the 7th. She kept walking. The perimeter sergeant, a veteran named Kethrasan with 28 years of service, later filed the following in his action report. The human female approached at steady pace. No deviation, no hesitation, no observable fear response. At 30 meters, I activated the targeting tone, the standard audible warning used to signal that a subject is within terminal range. She slowed, looked at the source of the tone. Then she nodded as if she understood and kept walking. Kethrasan had stood down. He later said he still wasn't entirely sure why. She nodded, he wrote. She acknowledged the situation. I have faced armed combatants and hostile biological entities and beings that wanted to take my life. I have never had a subject nod at me. I didn't know what to do. He had radioed General Savar. Savar had come to the perimeter herself. They stood facing each other across a barrier. Brigadier General Elena Vasquez-Acoro and General Keth Savar, two military commanders from species that had never met before. And the relay feed transcript of what followed is something I have read so many times that I have pieces of it memorized. Vasquez-Acoro spoke first. Her voice translator came through clearly. I'm Elena. I assume you're in charge here. Savar's response. I am General Keth Savar, commanding the 7th Legion of the Keth-Varal Dominion. I have authority to receive your surrender protocols. Vasquez-Acoro. I'm sure you do. I'm not here to surrender. Savar, you understand the nature of the force arrayed against your planet. Vasquez-Acoro. I do. We've done the math. You're impressive. A pause. But you've been sitting in that field for 3 days, and you haven't done anything. Savar, we are awaiting your government's response to our terms. Vasquez-Acoro. I know. Here's the thing, my government isn't going to send that response, not because we're being difficult, because we genuinely don't have the concept of species-wide surrender in our political vocabulary. We've never surrendered as a planet. We've barely managed to surrender as nations. As a species to an external force? Another pause. I don't think we know how. The transcript noted a 12-second gap. 12 seconds is a long silence in a field negotiation. Then Savar, every species we have encountered has understood the concept. Vasquez-Acoro, we're a bit unusual. Savar, we have weapons capable of rendering your planet's surface uninhabitable. Vasquez-Acoro, I know. Savar, you understand what that means. Vasquez-Acoro, yes, but here's what I need you to understand, General. If you do that, you'll have a dead planet. You won't have a surrendered humanity. Because even if you kill 99% of us, the 1% who survive will spend the rest of their lives making sure that something very bad happens to whoever gave that order. That's not a threat. That's just who we are. It's a character trait. I'm not sure we can help it, honestly. Another gap. This one was 19 seconds. Then Savar, you are describing an irrational response pattern. Vasquez-Acoro. Oh, absolutely. We're wildly irrational sometimes. That's actually one of the things I'd encourage you to factor into your models if you haven't already. Savar, why would irrationality be a factor in our favor? Vasquez-Acoro, and this is the part I have memorized. Because rational beings calculate the odds and stand down when the odds are impossible. We calculate the odds too. We just respond differently to impossible odds. I don't know if that's bravery or stupidity, probably some of both, but it's consistent. Savar transmitted that exchange back to us within the hour. The Conclave's emergency session lasted 4 more days. Chapter 6, What the Models Missed. I need to pause here and explain something about our predictive models, because without that context, the rest of this account doesn't make sense. Keth-Varal's strategic doctrine is built on anticipation. We model enemy behavior across thousands of variables: resource availability, technological capacity, population psychology, historical precedent, and we produce probability distributions that tell our commanders what to expect. This system has worked for 800 years. It has a success rate that I am not authorized to give you the exact number for, But I will tell you it is high enough that most of our military planners treat the models as essentially definitive. The models failed on humans. Not slightly, not in minor edge cases. They failed in ways that were so fundamental and so consistent that our chief modeling analyst, Yeth Kalun, submitted a formal report to the conclave on day 12 of the engagement that began with the following sentence. I believe we are modeling the wrong variables. Yeth Kalun was 68 cycles old and had been in predictive analysis for 40 years. She had never submitted a report beginning with a belief statement. Analysts don't believe things. They project things with confidence intervals. She believed. The models had predicted human behavior based on what any rational species does when faced with overwhelming force. Threat assessment, resource calculation, survival optimization. The models were not wrong about the assessment part. Our analysts confirmed that human scientists and military strategists had done exactly that math, had run exactly those numbers, had arrived at exactly the conclusion that we expected. They knew they couldn't win. What the models could not account for was that knowing you can't win doesn't stop humans from fighting. It doesn't even slow them down. In the 12 days the 7th had been on the ground, human military units from 16 different nations had positioned themselves in staging areas around the landing zone perimeter. Not advancing, not yet, but present. Organized. They had established supply chains that our logistics analysts called improvised but functional. They had developed communication protocols between units from countries that didn't share a language and barely shared a political framework. They had solved, in 12 days, coordination problems that our strategists would have projected taking months. And while all that was happening, in their laboratories and factories and research facilities, they had kept working. The orbital platform development had not slowed. It had accelerated. Our fleet scanners picked up energy signatures from 17 different facilities that matched the profile of advanced propulsion research. 3 of them had signatures that didn't match anything in our technology database. Yeth Kalun's report continued. The fundamental assumption underlying our models is that species facing extinction-level threat will prioritize survival above all other drives. This assumption has been confirmed in contact with 847 other species. With humans, this assumption appears to be incorrect. Humans facing extinction-level threat appear to prioritize something other than individual or collective survival. Based on behavioral data collected over the past 12 cycles, my working theory is that they prioritize continuation. Not of themselves specifically, but of something they consider larger than themselves. This distinction may seem minor. I believe it is the key variable we have consistently failed to model. I read that report so many times that I could recite it from memory. Continuation, not survival, continuation. A species that would die would choose to die, rather than allow certain things to end. I thought about the man who had knocked on our scout ship's hull. I thought about the research papers submitted about the destroyed moon. I thought about Brigadier General Vasquez Acoro standing alone 30 meters from a targeting system and nodding at the warning tone and walking forward anyway. I thought about what that actually was, in psychological terms. And I began, slowly, to understand why the conclave was afraid. Chapter 7, The Mountain Incident. Day 17 of the engagement. I was at my monitoring station when the alert came through. Priority signal from General Savar. Not her usual update cadence. This was flagged urgent, which in 28 years of command she had used approximately 6 times. I pulled the feed. Savar's voice was steady. It was always steady. But there was something in the transmission quality, something in the tiny gaps between her words, that told me this was the kind of steady that takes considerable effort. Intelligence Division, this is General Savar, Priority 1 transmission. We have had an engagement. Not an incident, an engagement. Kethvaral military language is precise. An incident is unexpected contact. An engagement is combat. A unit of 40 human soldiers entered our perimeter on the eastern boundary at local night. They moved on foot through terrain our sensors flagged as non-traversable, a ridge system with approximately 70-degree slopes and active icing conditions. Our eastern perimeter unit, 3rd Company, 2nd Cohort, intercepted them at the interior wire. I was writing notes without looking at the page. The human unit designation appears to be a mountain infantry regiment from a nation called Norway, engaged our perimeter forces. I want to be precise in my language here because I think it's important for the analytical record. They knew they couldn't win. Their equipment, while impressive by Type 3 biological standards, was not capable of penetrating our perimeter defenses. They were armed with kinetic projectile weapons and what appears to be a locally manufactured energy disruption device. The latter I have attached specifications for because our engineers haven't seen anything like it and believe it was built in the past 10 days. Pause. They fought anyway. Third Company held the perimeter. The Norwegians took casualties. They didn't retreat. I want to repeat that for clarity. They took casualties that exceeded 50% of their unit strength and they didn't retreat. They kept pressing the perimeter until our field medics— I made the decision to deploy field medics. I will explain that decision in my formal report— crossed the wire to provide assistance. Another pause, the longest one I'd heard from Savar. The moment our medics crossed the wire, the Norwegians stopped fighting. They allowed our medical teams to treat their wounded. One of the surviving human soldiers, a young male, which is to say a very young male, perhaps 20 of their years by the developmental indicators, sat down next to one of my medics and said something to her. The translator rendered it as, "We knew we weren't going to push you back. That wasn't the point. The point was to show you that we'd try." Static equipment noise. Wind, probably the Canadian Shield in autumn. I have filed this engagement under Combat Log 7, but I am also requesting a consultation with Intelligence Division's Behavioral Analysis team, because I need help understanding what I'm looking at. I have studied military history for my entire career. I have fought 12 engagements and studied 400. I have encountered species that fight bravely, species that fight desperately, species that fight with remarkable tactical sophistication. I have never encountered a species that fights to demonstrate a point. Her voice didn't break. It's not possible, physiologically, for Keth-Varel voices to break the way human voices do. But there was something in the compression of her words, in the way she spoke the next line, that I think was the closest she could get. What is the point, exactly, that they're trying to make? I sat at my monitoring station for a long time after that transmission ended. I thought about the young soldier, 20 years old, sitting in the snow next to a Keth-Varel field medic, wounds being treated by hands that had been trying to contain him 6 minutes earlier. Saying, with what I could only imagine was extraordinary calm, "We knew we weren't going to push you back. That wasn't the point." I typed up my analysis report. I filed it. I added a note at the bottom that I immediately flagged for the commander's eyes. The point, I believe, is that they won't stop. The engagement was not a tactical maneuver. It was a declaration. They are not telling us they can win. They are telling us they won't quit. These are not the same message, and we have been treating them as if they were. Commander Velkareth called me into his office an hour after I filed the report. He read the note back to me. Then he said, "How certain are you?" "Certain enough that I think we need to reconsider the mission parameters," I said. He was quiet for a while. His secondary limbs were fully folded. "The conclave won't want to hear that." "I know, sir. It will look like we failed." "I know." He looked at me for a long moment. "File an official recommendation for mission review. Use my authorization code." I went back to my station and did exactly that. The conclave, as predicted, was not pleased. Chapter 8, the 33rd day. Day 33. The mission was supposed to be resolved by day 30 at the outside. That had been the projection. That had been the promise the conclave had made to itself when it selected the 7th. 30 days, full Dominion authority established. On day 33, General Savar transmitted what would later be called the most unusual document in Dominion military history. It was not a combat report. It was not a negotiation update. It was a philosophical inquiry, addressed formally to the Intelligence Division, the Strategic Council, and the conclave itself. It ran to 67 pages. I will not summarize all of it, but there are sections I need to share because they changed everything that came after. She wrote about the civilians first, about how in 33 days the crowd at the perimeter had never stopped growing. By this point, there were tens of thousands of humans camped in the fields around the 7th's position, families, individuals, organized groups, people who had traveled from across the continent and from other continents by whatever means available. They were not protesting. They were not attacking. They were watching, bearing witness, setting up camps with extraordinary organization, with sanitation systems and food distribution and medical tents. The 7th's field observers estimated a permanent rotating population of 40,000, with peaks at certain times of day. "I don't know what to call this," Savar wrote. "In the history of Dominion military operations, I have never encountered a civilian population that responded to an occupying military force by setting up a campground and watching. They have brought instruments of music. They have held what I believe are religious observances. 3 human children, presented themselves at our perimeter yesterday morning with what the translator identified as drawings, visual art created by hand on flat sheets, which they apparently wished to give to our soldiers as gifts. The drawings, the field report noted, were accepted, because Perimeter Sergeant Kethrasan, faced with 3 children holding out artwork, had not had a protocol. And so he had done what Kethrasan apparently did when he didn't have a protocol. He had made a judgment call. He had taken the drawings. They were posted, last I heard, somewhere inside the Kethmuran command deck. I don't know if that's true, I hope it is." Savar's inquiry then turned to the military situation, and this is the part that I want to be precise about, because it's important. "The 7th has not been defeated," she wrote. "I want to be absolutely clear on that point. We have not been defeated. Our perimeter has held. Our orbital assets are secure. Our weapons capability is fully intact. By any conventional measure of military engagement, we are winning." Pause. I can feel the pause even in written form. And yet I find myself unable to project an endpoint. In 33 days, human military capability has increased, not decreased. Their orbital platforms number 47, up from 31 on arrival. 3 of the 7 energy facilities I noted in my initial report have gone dark, not because they were destroyed or abandoned, but because they appear to have been moved underground beyond our sensor capability. Their coordination between national military units has improved to a degree that I can only describe as remarkable for a species with no prior galactic military experience. More than this, and this is the element I find most difficult to articulate, I cannot find the point at which they intend to stop. With every species I have encountered, every engagement I have studied, there is a threshold. A point at which a rational assessment of the situation produces a recalibration of goals. The Mern recalibrated at 30% casualties. The Varathi collective recalibrated at the destruction of their second primary habitat. The Sulan propagation surrendered when their leadership was captured. There is always a threshold. I have been attempting to identify the human threshold for 33 days. I have run every analysis available to me. I have consulted with my senior officers, my strategic advisors, my behavioral specialists. I have had 4 extended conversations with Brigadier General Vasquez Acoro, who I will note is one of the most formidable individuals I have encountered in a professional context. I cannot find the threshold. I am beginning to wonder if there is one. She ended the inquiry with a question. One question after 67 pages, just one. What do you do with an enemy that will not reach a threshold? That will continue adapting and building and pressing, not out of irrationality or aggression, but out of something that looks, from the outside, almost like love for what they are fighting to preserve. The conclave met in emergency session for the second time in 43 days. I was not in the observation gallery this time. I was at my monitoring station, reading Savar's document for the 6th time, when Velkareth came to stand beside me. He didn't say anything for a while, just stood there. Then, the conclave is going to order a withdrawal. I looked up. They're framing it as a strategic realignment, he said. Repositioning to allow for additional analysis. The language is being carefully crafted. Went 3 days, maybe 4. Depends on how long it takes to produce documentation that doesn't look like what it is. What is it? He looked at me. His secondary limbs were at his sides, fully relaxed for the first time in weeks. It's what happens, he said quietly, when something surprises you so completely that you need time to reconsider everything you thought you knew. Chapter 9, The Last Night. The night before the withdrawal, I was still at my station when the final batch of transmissions came through. Not official reports, not mission updates. These were personal transmissions, the kind soldiers send at the end of deployments. personal logs, messages to family, the unofficial record that sits alongside the official one and often tells a more honest story. Some of them were flagged to Intelligence Division for behavioral analysis, which is how I came to read them. I shouldn't have spent as long with them as I did. They weren't my assignment, but I couldn't stop. There was a message from Perimeter Sergeant Kethrasan to his household unit back home. Most of it was the usual end-of-deployment content. He was coming home. He was well. He had questions about the property maintenance records. But at the end, almost as an afterthought, he wrote, "The children gave me drawings. I put them in my kit. I don't know why. I'll tell you about it when I'm home." There was a message from Captain Velmuran of 3rd Company, the unit that had engaged the Norwegian soldiers. She had filed the engagement report with precise military efficiency. In her personal log, she wrote something different. "The young one, the one who sat in the snow and said they were fighting to prove a point. His name is Christopher. He told me before they were evacuated." I thought names were just a human organizational convention. I don't think that anymore. He shook my secondary hand when they took him to the medical transport. He'd never seen a secondary hand before. He looked at it for a moment like he was memorizing it, and then he shook it anyway. I have been in combat for 22 years. I don't know what to do with that. And then there was a recording from General Savar herself. Not a transmission, a personal audio log, the kind the senior command keeps for their own records. I don't know how it ended up in the flagged intelligence batch. I suspect Savar included it deliberately, knowing it would be reviewed. That would be like her. She spoke quietly. The background sounds of the command ship filtered through. The hum of systems, the distant sound of movement, the particular acoustic quality of metal under slight atmospheric pressure. "Day 34, tomorrow we withdraw. I have written the formal reports. I have structured the withdrawal protocol. Everything is in order." A pause. I have been thinking about what Vasquez Acoro said to me in our 4th meeting. She wasn't speaking for the record. It was after the formal session ended while her staff was packing up their materials. She said, "I hope you come back, when things are calmer. I think we'd have a lot to talk about." Another pause. I didn't know what to say. I still don't know what the correct response to that is. She was expressing what? Hope. Goodwill, interest. After 34 days of her people fighting and dying to demonstrate that they won't stop, and she hopes I come back for a conversation. Savar's voice did something complex that I still can't fully describe. Not quite emotion by Keth Verrill standards, but something adjacent to it. "I think I do too. Come back. When things are calmer. I think I want to understand what they are properly. Not as a tactical assessment. Not as a threat evaluation. I think I want to understand what a species is that builds and fights and draws pictures for strangers and sends young soldiers into hopeless engagements to make a point and submits research papers about destroyed moons and knocks on hulls and refuses." Her voice settled. "Refuses to become less than what they are, no matter what is pointed at them." I don't have a name for that quality. They probably do. They seem to have words for everything. Static. End log. I sat at my monitoring station for a long time after the log ended. Outside my window, a narrow viewport in the intelligence building, looking out over the crystalline plains, one of the twin suns was setting. The light was red-gold, the way it always is at this time of evening, catching the spires of the command tower and turning them to fire. I thought about a planet far away, with one small yellow sun and one moon and oceans that covered 70% of its surface. I thought about what it must look like from orbit, that blue-white glow, that fragile-looking sphere that was somehow the least fragile thing the Dominion had ever encountered. I thought about Kethrasan's drawings, about Christopher shaking a secondary hand, about research papers about destroyed moons. I thought about Vasquez Acoro walking alone across 50 meters of open ground toward a targeting system, nodding at the warning tone and walking forward anyway. I started writing a report. Not an official one, a personal one, the kind I'd never file, the kind you write because you need to put something down before you lose it. I wrote we sent our best. We sent 6,000 of the finest soldiers the Dominion has ever produced, under the command of the most capable general in our military history, backed by the most powerful weapons array ever assembled for a single engagement. We sent them to defeat a species that had just figured out sustained orbital spaceflight. We gave them every advantage. We gave them resources and history and 4 centuries of unbroken success. And then something happened that none of our models, none of our history, none of our 800 years of expansion experience had prepared us for. Nothing happened to us, not an attack we couldn't counter, not a weapon we couldn't match, not a tactic we hadn't seen. What happened was them, just them being what they are. Completely, consistently, without apology or retreat, being exactly what they are. And it turned out that was enough. It turned out that was more than enough. I stopped writing, saved the document to my personal archive, closed the file. The sun had finished setting. The plains were going dark, the crystalline surface catching the first starlight. Somewhere out there, 9 days of fast transit away, a blue-white sphere was spinning through space with its one yellow sun, and its one small moon and its 7 billion inhabitants who did not know, and would probably never know, exactly what had happened in those 34 days. Although, I reconsidered that last thought. Actually, I suspected some of them knew, the ones who had been there. The ones who had stood in the fields and watched. The ones who had driven through the night to hold up signs about wildlife. I thought they probably had a pretty good idea. The withdrawal took 3 days. It was conducted with the full precision and professionalism that characterized everything the 7th did. No incidents, no departing demonstrations, no final gestures. The assault craft lifted. The orbital assets recovered their platforms. The Saren's fist ascended from her holding position. The Void Walker stood down from orbital watch. The Kethmeron received General Savar aboard and confirmed all units accounted for. 6,183 soldiers, 19 casualties, all from the Norwegian engagement. General Savar's medics had treated 11 Norwegian soldiers. 7 of those had survived their wounds. Sergeant Rossan's kit contained 3 hand-drawn pictures. The Conclave's official position was that the Sol system had been assessed and designated a protected observation zone, a designation that technically meant we had strategic interest in monitoring the region. In practice, it meant something simpler. We had looked at what was there and decided that what was there did not need us to do anything about it. The Conclave did not officially announce a withdrawal. The framing held strategic realignment, repositioning for analysis. The language was crafted well enough that, within the Dominion, most citizens accepted it without much discussion. Yeth Kalun submitted 3 more analytical reports over the following year. Each one was longer than the last. Each one circled the same central finding. Our models were built on assumptions that were not universal. The assumption of threshold. The assumption of survival optimization. The assumption that rational assessment of impossible odds produces de-escalation. None of those assumptions applied to humans. She recommended in her final report that a dedicated research division be established to study human behavioral patterns, not as a threat assessment. She used a word that I had never seen in an intelligence document before. She called it a study, the way you'd study something fascinating. The way you'd study something you'd encountered that changed your understanding of what's possible. The Conclave approved the division, quietly, without announcement. I requested a transfer to the new division. I got it. I am 61 cycles old as I write this. It's been 38 years since that morning in the observation gallery, watching Conclave Master Yethsoren grip the podium with her secondary limbs folded to her chest. 38 years since the 7th departed. 38 years since the signals went quiet, not because something had happened to our soldiers, but because the situation had become something for which our signals didn't have adequate language. I have spent those 38 years studying humans. Not in the way the intelligence community typically studies a subject, not cataloging threats, not assessing capabilities, not projecting trajectories. Studying them the way you study something that matters to you, the way you study something that has changed you. I have learned their languages, 6 of them now with a working knowledge of 3 others. I have read their literature and their history and their science and their philosophy and their poetry, which is extraordinary, incidentally, in ways I would need another document entirely to articulate. I have watched their films and listened to their music and read the academic papers of their biologists and physicists and philosophers. I have tried, for 38 years, to understand what Savar was reaching for at the end of that personal log, what quality she couldn't name. I have found some words. The humans have many, as she suspected. The one I keep returning to is one they use so often it seems almost simple. They say it about individuals. They say it about communities. They say it about moments and movements and quiet decisions made in private and loud decisions made in public. They say it when a soldier walks into an impossible engagement to make a point. They say it when a researcher submits a paper about a destroyed moon. They say it when a general walks alone across 50 meters of open ground toward a targeting system. They call it spirit. It's not a perfect translation of what I mean. Their word carries religious weight that I'm not sure I intend. But the core of it, the part that survives the translation, is something like the part of you that continues even when everything else says stop. Humans have that, in extraordinary quantities, in quantities that our models were simply not equipped to measure because our models didn't know it existed. I have a recording of a conversation I had with Brigadier General Elena Vasquez-Acoro. She's retired now, an old woman, what humans call a grandmother, living somewhere with a lot of trees and apparently an excessive number of dogs. We speak occasionally. She is still one of the most formidable people I have ever met. I asked her once, directly, what she was thinking when she walked alone across those 50 meters. What was in her mind? She was quiet for a moment. She is the kind of person who takes questions seriously. I was scared, she said. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely, properly terrified. My hands were shaking inside my jacket. I could feel the targeting, whatever that sound was. The warning tone, I could feel it. What made you keep walking? She thought about it. I kept thinking about my daughter, she said. She was 17 at the time, and I thought, what story does she hear? When she's told about this day, 40 years from now, what story gets told? And I realized the story I wanted told was, someone walked forward, just someone walked forward. Pause. That's it, honestly. It wasn't brave, it wasn't strategy. It was just, I didn't want the story to be that we froze. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about Christopher, 20 years old in the snow, shaking a secondary hand. Probably thinking about a story too, about the story of his country, his unit, his moment. I thought about 600 civilians with telescopes and funnel cakes, and a sign asking us to respect local wildlife. I thought about research papers about destroyed moons. I thought about 17 new orbital platforms launched in 6 days. And I thought about what Yeth Kalun had written, about continuation, not individual survival, not collective preservation, something beyond both of those things. The preservation of something they consider larger than themselves, even at cost to themselves. Vasquez-Acoro's story, Christopher's handshake, Rassan's drawings, Savar's question. They were all the same thing, different expressions of the same deep, aching, extraordinary thing. A species that looks at the end of everything and thinks, not yet, not while I can still move forward. Not because they'll win. Sometimes just to prove that they'll try. People ask me sometimes, colleagues, younger analysts who have heard the story, people who find out what I spent my career studying, they ask me what happened. They phrase it in the terms of military outcome. Did we win? Did they win? What was the result? I tell them the same thing every time. The signals went silent because we ran out of language for what we were seeing, not because the situation ended. Not because the engagement resolved into a clear outcome. The signals went silent because the reports stopped being able to contain what was actually happening, which was that 6,000 of the most elite soldiers in Dominion history had met something they couldn't categorize, and had spent 34 days trying to categorize it, and had finally come home with a question instead of an answer. That's what the silence was. Not defeat, not victory. A question. And the question, Savar's question, my question, the question that has occupied 38 years of my professional life, is still not fully answered. Maybe it can't be. Maybe some things aren't meant to be fully understood by beings standing outside them. But here is what I know, after 38 years and 6 languages and thousands of documents, and one conversation with a retired brigadier general surrounded by dogs. Humans are not the most powerful species in the galaxy. They're not the most advanced. They're not the oldest or the largest or the most numerous. But they are the only species, the only one in 800 years of Dominion expansion that we sent our best to defeat. And the best we could do, against 7 billion people on one small blue planet, was come home with a question. I think about that a lot. I think it might be the most important thing the Dominion ever learned. And I think the humans, sitting there on their planet, with their one yellow sun and their rebuilt moon and their 47 orbital platforms and their underground research facilities, and their children making drawings for strangers, probably could have told us, if we'd asked properly at the start instead of projecting weapons at their moon. They could have told us something simple, something they've apparently known for a very long time. You can't defeat a thing that doesn't know how to stop being what it is. You can challenge it, you can threaten it, you can take things from it, you can make it hurt. But you cannot defeat it. Because when it sits in the snow with wounds on its body, and a long way to go and no guarantee of any outcome except more difficulty, it shakes your hand. It memorizes your face. And it keeps going. That's what the silence was in the end. That's what we came home with. Not a defeat. Not a victory. Just a very quiet understanding, the kind that arrives not with noise but with weight, settling into you slowly, changing the shape of everything it touches. That we had looked at something ancient and new at the same time, something that had survived ice ages and plagues and wars against itself, and the cold arithmetic of an indifferent universe. And it was still here, still building, still reaching, still drawing pictures for strangers, still walking forward across open ground with shaking hands.